Hi, this is F. Paul Driscoll with another episode of Opera News' Sightlines. My guest today is the very distinguished American composer and performer, Missy Mazzoli. Missy, welcome to Sightlines.
Hi,
Great to
thanks
have
for
you
having
here.
me.
So I'm in New York. I'm not sure where you are, but your next performance that I look forward to is mid-January at Juilliard, Approving Up,
Yes.
which is your third opera of the four that you've had produced?
Yes,
Okay.
that's
So
correct.
if you wouldn't mind, if we could start at the beginning, when did you decide that composition was going to be it for you, that you would be a composer, number one, and number two, opera composing, possibly the most difficult kind of composing there is. You jumped into that as well.
Correct.
How did that start?
Yeah, well, so I knew I was going to be a composer from a very young age. I started writing when I was about 10, and I had, played piano like a lot of other kids since I was 7, was really captivated by music, but I was not destined to be a performer. I needed something that really let me explore a lot of other areas. I was interested, even at that age, in poetry and theater and film, and needed something that would let me combine all of that. And composing really did that for me, even super young. And so I just stuck with it ever since. And as far as opera, I never saw myself as an opera composer. Because I didn't really have access to opera until I was in my late teens. I saw my first opera at 19 at the Met. It was Wozzeck, which is significant. But once I started writing opera, about 10 years ago, I immediately fell in love with it. And I thought, this is what I've been looking for. It felt like coming home. And I was working with, really was working with directors like Daniel Fish, James Dara. These were directors I was working with super early on my first couple operas. And Daniel Fish and I did a workshop together at Opera Philadelphia. And I just the conversations we were having were the kinds of things I'd always wanted to talk about with collaborators. It was about the psychology of characters and ways to bring out what's going on in a character's mind more effectively. And this is what I always wanted to talk about with somebody.
So it's the collaborative aspect of it that is part of what attracts you to it?
It's part of it. It's so many things. It's the collaborative aspect. It's just being involved in the world of theater. And that's sort of tangential to the collaborations. And then I'm working with choreographers and set designers and costume designers and people who aren't necessarily only coming from a classical music world.
Right.
That's very exciting and inspiring to me. And then really it's the ability to tell stories in a way that is more direct than creating works without words. I'm very interested in reflecting what's going on in the world around me, and opera is the most direct, straightforward way to do that within a musical medium.
When you were studying composition as a young composer, did you have any formal study of voice? Was that discussed in the classroom?
Not at all. And I'm now a professor. I'm teaching at Bard. I'm teaching at the New School, and I'm running these vocal writing workshops for my students because I feel like that's a major gap in conservatory education. We never talked about writing for the voice. We never talked about writing opera or what would go into that. And it was a different era. I think that opera was, the world of new opera in America was less robust, even 10 years ago, and certainly 20 years ago when I was studying. So, to think that there would be a viable career option was like ludicrous at that point. And now I think there are a lot more options for young composers. But I think that all of that, it's a big thing to take on. And, when you're in a 2-year graduate program, to think about trying to start to write an opera is kind of insane. But I think that there's things you can teach students that can kind of guide them into this as part of their career.
But I've been impressed with the works of yours that I've heard live, especially Breaking the Waves. You write very well for the voice. Do you
Thank
sing
you.
yourself at all?
No, not at all. I have a terrible voice. It's kind of just like this running joke with me and my librettist Royce Vavrick and my friends. It's just that I can't carry a tune at all. But I think that actually helps me write for the voice, and that
Really?
yeah, I took, I do sing everything I write, just in the privacy of these four walls here in my studio,
Hmm.
never publicly. And I'm hyper aware of, the limitations, but also the expressive power of the voice. And I have a lot of respect for it because it still feels very mysterious to me. I did take voice lessons when I was composer in residence at Opera Philadelphia,
Hmm.
and I cried through all of them. I was just like, I felt so vulnerable and so exposed. And
Yeah.
when your body is your instrument, it opens up, for me, it opened up all of my insecurities about myself as a musician, who I was. It
Yeah.
was insane. And so, knowing that that is what singers have overcome or are going through was really eye-opening. So,
Let's talk a little bit about Proving Up, if you
mhm,
don't mind.
sure.
That is something that has moved from place to place to place and had several different productions.
Mhm.
Are you involved in each iteration of it? I mean, obviously, when it's first done, you're very much involved in the creation of it. But as it gets legs, as they say in show business, do you stay as involved as a creator?
Unfortunately, no. It's a good problem to have, I guess, in that,
Yeah,
Proving Up, I've actually lost count of the number of productions we've had in
yeah,
America. It's something that is done at, universities, conservatories, as well as professional companies.
yeah,
And so I just physically can't be everywhere at once.
right.
And that's great. I do, my favorite place to be in the world is in opera rehearsals. I love watching a piece come to life in front of me, and I love watching directors put their stamp on my work.
Hmm.
So, I wish I could be there. I'm going to stop into the Juilliard rehearsals because I'm in town. But yeah, it's hard to be there all the time.
I have a friend who is a composer, not opera, but she works in musical theater. And when she was studying at a conservatory, which shall be nameless, she was given instructions as to what to do and not do if she wanted to get her work produced.
Mhm.
Don't make it too big, don't make it too thorny, don't make
Right.
too many people. Did you ever get guidelines like that from people? Like, Missy, you're crazy, this is too big, or Missy, you're crazy, this is too controversial.
Sure. But I think I've always, yeah, it's hard to think about. It's hard to remember back. That was a while ago. But I think there's this weird pressure in school to kind of make everybody happy. Your work has to be thorny enough and academic enough to satisfy
Yeah,
people in academia, your professors, but it has to be accessible enough to make money at the box office, which, if we can pretend as Americans that doesn't matter, but it does. Like, we're
yeah.
not separate from the capitalism here. So, and so I'm always kind of weighing, that's very much on my mind, and
Hmm.
I'm someone who stylistically is omnivorous, and I am just taking in a lot of that. And I am inspired by very thorny, academic music, and with a small audience. And I'm inspired by, hit musicals. And my music doesn't sound like either of those, but I'm
Hmm.
drawing from all of that. So it took me a long time to shed those sort of voices that were really not helpful, because everything you write feels either too thorny or too accessible. And it's really hard to feel like, oh, I have this right. So in the end, you just have to listen to yourself.
Sure. Was there any particular opera? I mean, obviously, Wozzeck is a significant first step. Did you choose that on purpose, or was that accidental?
I
Choosing Wozzeck, I mean.
Sure. Yeah. No, I chose it on purpose. I liked Berg's music.
Yeah,
I was in school in Boston at the time. I saw that they were performing this. I was 19 and just took the bus down and didn't know anything about the work until I got here, and it was life-changing.
yeah.
And I sat in the back row of the Met, the seats where you can actually touch the ceiling.
I've
Um,
been there.
It's great, and
Yeah.
I loved it. I was the last seat in the last row, and I was like, this is amazing. But
Yeah.
even then, it wasn't, I didn't see it and think, oh, I could do that someday. That it just was not even in my realm of, and not even in my brain at all. It seemed
I-
impossible.
Is there any particular composer that inspires you?
Oh, sure. So many. I mean, the ones that are consistently sort of in the back of my head are, Benjamin Britten, Meredith Monk, Philip Glass, David Lang, and George Benjamin, Thomas
Mhm.
Adès. These are specifically thinking about operatic composition. These are the people who are sort of always there.
Why do you think that the appetite for new opera has become so much more robust, to use the word you used a little bit earlier, in the past 10 years? Because there's, to me anyway, when I'm asked the question as a journalist and they say, do you think that opera is in trouble? And I said, I always say the business model is troubled.
Mhm.
I don't think the art form is troubled, because there are so many new composers who are working on things that would never have been thought of
Mhm.
15 or 20 years ago. That's healthy. But why has that happened, do you think?
I, I'm not sure, but I have some theories. I think it's a combination of things. I think that,
Mhm.
and it's a sort of chicken and egg thing. I think that there are a lot more opportunities for young people to try their hand at writing opera. So you have these
Mhm.
programs from American Opera Projects, American Lyric Theater, Beth Morrison's
Prototype, yeah.
company, the Washington National Opera, who they're providing opportunities for people under 30 to like try writing opera, and those did not exist 10 years ago,
Yeah.
or 20 years ago. So
Mhm.
there's that, and I think that there's a kind of expansion of what opera can be, through those companies. I think Beth Morrison in particular, it's like people see opera and it can be just one person on a stage with electronics. It
Right.
can be two singers in a string quartet. It can be something massive, like Exterminating Angel. Like, so it doesn't have to be these traditional forces. And that's always been true, but I think we're seeing that in practice a lot more. Um, yeah, and I think I like to think of it as like it's like things are coming full circle, to where opera is meeting what's happening in rock music, in metal
Yeah.
music, in theater, in dance. You have choreographers like Crystal Pite. You have metal bands like Liturgy, and their last album has been they describe it as an opera, and there's like a
Mhm.
quote from Messiaen in that work, and it's like it just works artistically. So yeah, I think there's a lot more ways in short.
You have a pending project, an opera of the Saunders novel, Lincoln in the Bardo, which is due at the Met in a future season. How did that project come to you? Did you pick the novel, or did someone hand that to you and say, make an opera of this?
So the short answer is I picked it. I mean,
Mhm.
George is one of my favorite writers. He's up
Yeah.
there top two. And when I was called into the Met office, this was in 2018, it feels like a lifetime ago. They said, we'd like to commission you. Do you have any ideas? And it was just at the top of my brain. I really didn't. That was like the only idea I had. So it was really lucky that they went for it. But I'd been talking a little bit with my librettist Royce Favrick about
Yeah.
um, trying to get the rights, and just in a sort of casual way. And then after that meeting, I was like, okay, we have to go for this. This actually, thinking of it on a stage like the Met makes it seem possible. And I have all these ideas for how it could be an opera. I think not having a big stage for it made me, I didn't want to pursue it until I had a place for it to,
Right.
yeah.
And is that something that, with the other operas that you've done, whether Breaking the Waves or Proving Up, do you think of the space at the same time you're composing? Because clearly with the Met, you'll never lack room to do anything in whatever dimension you want to extend the action, or the cast of characters, certainly.
Mm-hmm.
But when you're doing something like Proving Up, which is a much more intimate story, is that something that you think of the space as well when you're writing that?
I don't think of this physical space as much as I do the forces, which are
Okay,
they're related, so proving up was something that was designed to go anywhere. So it's a
yeah,
13-piece orchestra, it's 6 singers, you have sort of one of each voice type. So my idea from the beginning was that that could be done in schools and as well as professional companies. And so I'm thinking of that. With the Met, obviously it's a big orchestra, full chorus, still only 7 principals.
hmm,
Um, but a whole host of smaller roles. I mean, that novel has 117 characters in it.
yeah.
It will not be that, but I do see a stage full of people for the Met piece. And so, yeah, being able to picture it is really key in starting to write.
And that property, for lack of a better word, is a book,
Yes.
which people have read and I think can extend their own imagination into the words on the page. What about something like Breaking the Waves, which was a film, the Lars von Trier film, that people have already seen? Did you try to make, this is an awkward question and I apologize, but were you looking to make it like the movie, as unlike the movie as possible? How did you, as a composer and librettist team, get so deep into the heart of her,
Mhm.
When you didn't have the visual resources that a movie does of actually showing the ocean or
Mhm.
all that stuff?
Sure. Well, we do show there is, so my goal was
Mhm.
to put a lot of that into the music. So I
Right.
actually think that it's sort of this is an idea I got from Peter Grimes. The sound of the sea is in that score. And
Mhm.
so I think that our goal was to make something that was very different from the film,
Mhm.
but I think just by virtue of the genre, it was inevitably going to be very different. I mean, Breaking the Waves, I think it's significant that that movie has no underscoring.
Yeah.
Um, so there are little musical moments of like 70s pop tunes, and there's sort of diegetic sound, but there's no um, like swooping soundtrack that's sort of telling you how to feel or kind of
Right.
foreshadowing what's going to happen. So I think, and obviously in opera, you have that throughout, and that's the driving force. So I was able to sort of illuminate more of the psychology of the characters, particularly Bess, and provide layers to her character through the music. Um, and it's also just so different because Breaking the Waves, the film is shot mostly with handheld cameras.
Yeah.
There's so many close-ups.
Mhm.
The opening shot is a close-up of Emily Watson's face, and so we can't do that in opera. We tried to sort of have a sense of closeness through these arias,
Mhm.
that create a sense of intimacy. But the reality is that an audience member can look anywhere on stage, no matter what we're doing, with a singer singing what we feel is a very moving aria.
Mhm.
So I just think that the whole experience is something completely different. We were very faithful to the story, but the emotional experience, I think, is really very different, and that was the goal.
Yeah. As a composer, can you work on more than one thing at once?
Not really. I'm kind of hyper focused. I mean, right now I'm doing an arrangement for a singer, which is so that's a shorter project. I'm just taking a
Yeah.
couple of days off from writing Lincoln in the Bardo. But really, I'm just hyper focused on one thing at a time.
How long does it take you to do an opera? I mean, not you, Missy, alone, but
Mhm.
you working with the people who are part of your creative team.
It really varies. I and especially with COVID, I've lost all sense of time and everything
We
is
all have, yeah.
delayed. Yeah, but I think it's a minimum of 2 years of writing for me.
Mhm.
If it's a sort of full length, 2 hour work. But then it sometimes takes forever to get the rights to something. With the Met, like I said, they approached me in 2018, which is 5 years ago now. So
Yeah.
that will be, a gestation period of like 8 years before it premieres. And
Mhm.
that's not unusual at all.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
How long has it been like that? I mean, because you read all these things about the 19th century composers or even Mozart that they get a commission and then it's 3 or 4 weeks later. I mean, but certainly, I mean, it depends on the person. I mean, obviously, some people like Rossini had that facility, and also the fact that he reused little bits and pieces of operas to sort of throw things together. But people now seem to take much more care over writing these works, I think, and collaborate much more directly. Really collaborate as opposed to coming in and being in charge. But do you think that that's something that's been the case since you started to do this? Have you seen that situation change at all since you've started?
It hasn't changed for me in my
Mhm.
opera career. It's always been these sort of long timelines.
Yeah,
So yeah, and I think that that's just about the economics of the field, and like
yeah.
to raise enough money and to cast people years in advance. I mean, there's so many
Mhm.
factors that slow the timeline down. But also I always feel like I'm writing at a breakneck pace. So I just don't know how, I don't know how Mozart did it. I mean, there's a pressure now to create a whole new world with each new opera. You can't,
Yeah.
there's this thing where you really can't repeat yourself. And I don't think that was as much of a thing for Verdi or Mozart.
I think that, I mean, from my perspective, maybe I'm rewriting history, but I think that certainly for a lot of composers in the 18th century and for much of the 19th century, it was a festival art form. They were going to do it once, and then whatever happened to it next happened to it next. I mean, sometimes it was successful and moved on, but even then, when it moved on, arias were changed, scenes were changed, depending on what the forces were. It didn't start becoming something that people wanted to have finished, I think, until publishers got involved. Certainly with Puccini, once he got over the troubles of, say, something like Butterfly, that was a set property, and that was what got done pretty much everywhere.
Yeah.
But it's a little, to me, I think it feels a lot more intelligent now, I guess, or thoughtful, I guess, not intelligent. The way the process is done, that people are actually spending time on making it as good as it possibly can be. Unlike in the world of Broadway musicals that you mentioned before, obviously a lot of decisions get made out of town under pressure that perhaps don't get made in situations where there are previews and workshops and people are actually able to look at something and make it as good as it possibly can be, as opposed to just rushing to finish it.
Yeah, I would say that, yeah, and a lot of Broadway shows can take twice as long as
Yeah,
opera. I'm thinking
yeah,
of like
exactly.
A Strange Loop, which
Yeah,
is a hit now, but it took 15 years to get
yeah.
that on Broadway. And I do think we suffer in opera from just a lack of, it would be nice to have previews. It would be nice to have the
Oh, I
chance
know.
to
Yeah,
see something on stage a little more before it premieres and is reviewed and is sort of like that the opinion is given. So,
I
but
still find that spooky with opera, because for the theater, I just saw Some Like It Hot early in previews, and there have been a lot of changes made in adjustments and things in and out and everything else like that, so that the show that opened is slightly different than what I saw. It's improved. Whereas, you see a brand new opera and it has to be ready right away. And I find that scary. And I admire anyone like you or Royce that, can put up with that particular pressure, because once it's done, it's done.
yeah, no, it's insane. It doesn't make any sense, but I've learned to sort of enjoy it. The opera made me a Buddhist, because it was so stressful. I would just come back from the first rehearsals of my first opera and just have to just deep breathe. And I'm like, oh, I'm gonna pursue Buddhism because I need something that helps me deal with this.
What is also on your horizon? I mean, you've got Lincoln in your uh, on your calendar, I think, for the next couple of years anyway. But is there anything else in terms of opera or other projects that you can talk about that are percolating for the future?
Unfortunately, nothing I can really talk about so much. I'm working on Royce Favrick and I are working on a couple of different ideas for post Lincoln, sort of pitching those around. One is a chamber opera and one is a musical.
Mm-hmm.
And uh, it's very exciting. And then I write so much instrumental music. I just premiered a percussion quartet with Third Coast Percussion, working on orchestral works. So all of that's going to.
Mhm. Has the landscape for composers outside the straight white male canon become any more welcoming? I mean, you obviously are someone who identifies as a woman composer. There are more women composers gaining visibility, but I think the same for people of color. Do you think the landscape is genuinely more welcoming, or is it something that we still have lots of work to do?
Well, both. There was only one way to go. It could not become less welcoming.
Exactly.
There was just like no representation, and now we have a little bit of representation. But I just think when your season does not reflect the population,
right,
country, the system is breaking down for people who are not male, who are not white. The system is breaking down somewhere. So I'm really committed to figuring out where that happens. I mean, that's why I started my nonprofit Luna Lab, to identify female, non-binary, and gender non-conforming teenagers who are interested in composition, and to really support them then, to start supporting them at that age. So yeah, I just think that's the Met, for instance, is obviously is going in a good direction. They've commissioned not only me and Janine Tesori, but they're exploring projects with Jessie Montgomery and Valerie Coleman. And this is great. But like, when you do the math, I mean, the numbers are crazy. And every time I describe the sort of statistics to people outside of opera, outside of classical music, they're horrified. I think we're always a little bit behind, and we really need to take a good hard look at why that is, why that continues to be the case.
Why do you think it continues to be the case? Just as an opinion. I mean, I'm not looking for a definitive answer, but.
Sure. I think that there's, until we have a substantial number of female, non-binary, non-white composers who are celebrated at the highest level, we're not going to see a bunch of people people who identify that way wanting to enter the field. So you have to really see it in order to feel that that's a path for you. I didn't really feel that composition was a path for me until I met Julia Wolf, Meredith Monk, and that was relatively late in my life. I was in my early 20s before I met them. So, and then I think what I mentioned, supporting young artists. I mean, we all make the decision to become. Most people make the decision to become performers and composers when they're in their mid to early teens. And I've taught a lot around the country. I've never seen a freshman class that has anywhere close to gender parity. So that tells me that something's happening to these young people before they get to college that's discouraging them from entering the field. And then lastly, I think that, women in positions of power in terms of who makes the decisions about who is programmed. I mean, all of my early commissions came from women, it was Beth Morrison, Melissa Smay, Francesca Zambello. These were people, those were the people who supported me before anyone else did. Fran Richards at ASCAP, all women. So I think until we see women in charge of opera companies more, we're also, and also I would say this extends to also people who are not white, again, just don't fit that straight white male idea. We're not, again, all these things need to happen in order for us to see a huge change.
I agree with you, but I mean, I think the change that has happened now is hopeful. I don't think it's anywhere near finished.
Absolutely.
Because,
totally.
Well, because when it's no longer news, then I think we'll be closer to being finished.
Exactly.
When a woman conducts at the Met without a number next to her name, she is the 12th woman to conduct there, or the 13th, or whatever.
Absolutely.
This has been a delightful experience for me. Thank you so much for giving us your time, and I wish you continued success.
Thank you. It was great to speak with you. Thank you.
Speak with you. So this is F. Ball Driscoll for Opera News' Sightlines. My very distinguished guest today has been Missy Mazzoli, It's been a joy for me to talk with her, and I encourage all of you to listen to her music. And it's happening everywhere, so you have no excuse. Thank you.
Thank you.